The ancient witness today is from Luke chapter 14, and this is in the inclusive version. Large crowds followed Jesus. He turned to them and said, "If any of you come to me without turning your back on your mother and your father, your loved ones, your sisters and brothers, indeed your very self, you can't be my follower. Anyone who doesn't take up the cross and follow me can't be my disciple. If any of you were going to build a tower, wouldn't you first sit down and calculate the outlay to see if you have enough money to complete the project? You'd do that for fear of laying the foundation and then not being able to complete the work, because anyone who saw it would jeer at you and say, 'You started a building and you couldn't finish it.' Or if the leaders of one country were going to declare war on another country, wouldn't they first sit down and consider whether with an army of 10,000 they could win against an enemy coming against them with 20,000? If they couldn't, they'd send a delegation while the enemy is still at a distance, asking for terms of peace. So count the cost. You can't be my disciple if you don't say goodbye to all of your possessions."
Thank you, Charlene. There was a time when I used to have to get physicals. Remember those? My first career involved a lot of physical stress, and the leaders where I worked required all their employees to get a physical every year. And I didn't particularly enjoy getting poked and prodded that often, but it worked out to be a good thing in terms of tracking my body and discovering problems. Every year I went, and each year my blood pressure reading read a little higher than the year before. And that was how I found out that I suffer from hypertension. At the time, I associated that condition with stress and anxiety and having rage inside. But I had a very calm nature and was kind and compassionate even back then. I didn't smoke, I didn't really drink, so I didn't think that would ever be a problem, even though both my parents were on medication to treat high blood pressure. I guess I just didn't think about it. And then one day, towards the end of my checkup, the doctor says to me, "We'll see you next year, maybe." I was like, what? What does that mean? So he told me about the presence of hypertension, and that was the reason for the maybe. And I was like, "I'm not stressed out, doc." And that's when he said to me, "You can't pick your parents." Well, of course not. Of course we can't pick our parents. That's a bit crossed up. So I said, "Don't be ridiculous." But he did get my attention. And since then, that saying stuck with me. You might have even heard me say that back to you a time or two. And what an interesting thought experiment that would make, though, if we could pick our parents. Well, don't worry, I'm not going to ever ask you that. Our parents, though, are part of our family of origin, which itself includes our siblings and our partners. It is possibly the most sacred form of human relationship, and most of the time it is where our deepest connections reside. Early Christians considered the household, the place where the life of the family of origin was lived out, that the household was to be the primary building block of love and tenderness and kindness. We certainly see that from the writings of Paul, the real Paul, that is. And similarly, in the Muslim faith, there is a belief that kindness is bestowed as a divine gift, bestowed by the Creator into the household. And thus, kindness begins at home. And in her book, Grounded, Diana Butler Bass notes that home is the location of the most tender practices of human relationships, where kindness is essential for safety and growth of all those within a household. And within the structure of genuine kindness, people develop the ability to trust, to receive from others, to dream and create. Her point is that if one learns kindness at home, it is much easier to practice kindness in the world. In our gospel story for the day, we come to one of the most challenging passages that Jesus utters. Last week, we saw how Jesus turned on his colleagues at a dinner party. And in a similar way, Jesus now turns on the large crowds that are following him. It's almost as if he's been saving up hard things to say. And now Jesus takes this opportunity to lay these hard things down on the masses. And on the surface, he seems to be speaking of the necessary things to lay aside in order to follow him. He tells of turning away from, or in its original context, even hating one's closest family members, of hating life itself, and seems to be advising individuals to begin carrying a cross and giving up their possessions. One might well think he's looking to thin out these crowds that are indeed following him. Speaking of that, I wonder what would the vice president think about this passage? I'm not sure he would approve of these words, as he's been known to prioritize family first over community, country, and then world. But why turn our back on those closest to us from birth? Why hate them when the very heart of Jesus' message seems to be about loving others as ourselves? To help the crowds understand, Jesus gives them a couple of story scenes, inviting those listening to imagine themselves in them. And in doing a bit of research, I discovered that back then, towers were built for a number of purposes, some defensive, some religious, but most of those were for not just for the builder of the tower, but for others as well. The tower that was built would help to keep the community safe. It might become part of the religious practices of the community, and it might store food for people if the going got tough. So an inability to finish the job because of a lack of planning has a negative impact on not just the ego of the builder, but for many people. In both story scenes that Jesus shares, we see examples of people embarking on significant endeavors without taking the time to fully reflect on what they were about to undertake. It's as if their actions were not matched by thoughtful consideration, and as a result, they were unable to complete their tasks. I guess sometimes being quick to act has the potential to take away from deep reflection. Now, in first century Palestine, one's family of origin dictated everything about their place in society. It seems one's status, wealth, and occupation were all bestowed by one's parents, or at least by their family name. Their family name. So much so that it determined one's identity and one's community of equals. In other words, one's family of origin designated how one fit within the Roman Empire and all its oppressive systems. Perhaps Jesus is suggesting to the masses that his would-be disciples may need to break with that family and all the expectations it places on them in order to love and serve their neighbors. Sometimes a little distance is needed. Many of us know in order to break with the social expectations that our families can place on us, especially when it involves conforming to societal norms that are restrictive to who we are as we see ourselves. Yet not everyone can afford to break away from their families. Some of us have parents who might not survive if we do not care for loved ones, be it through our presence or sending financial support back home. Well, according to scholar Nicola Torbet, the Greek word translated so long as hate, and in today's reading as turn your back on, that word miseo, means less to have a strong dislike for and more to esteem less the prestige, power, social standing, and social accommodating teaching that one receives from the family. Scholars say it is more of a first century hyperbole meant to exaggerate a contrast, that it can be seen more clearly. So rather than anger or hostility, it is intended to indicate that if there is a conflict, one's response to the demands of discipleship, to the demands of serving others, would need to take precedence over even the most sacred forms of human relationship. The goal is to become available to love in ways beyond one's family of origin. Jesus involved himself with so much intentionality and purpose in the lives of those around him. Here, he seems to be redefining identity and belonging. And what seems like disparate instructions and crossed up examples are actually tied together by the central purpose of looking out for the needs and goods of others. Perhaps Jesus is suggesting to his followers to remember the call to love the neighbor, that if we are beholden to our families of origin, then we will remain closed off from building deep, meaningful relationships with others. We will think that the most basic Christian acts of sharing and caring belong to such a small group as a family of origin. But if we have a rightly ordered life, or love, then our sense of family will expand and we will be able to be more and more like Jesus. At the least, it is a stark reminder that before embarking on any path, we must take time to pause and prayerfully reflect before moving forward. Jesus would have us understand that discipleship, that following Jesus, and life for that matter, is not a casual commitment. It is one that requires preparation and time. Just as someone wouldn't begin to build a tower or go to war without careful planning, I know some people do, it behooves us to seriously reflect on what it takes to live our lives in relationship with others. I know from experience that following the way of Jesus isn't casual or easy, not by any means. It does demand sacrifice and dedication and perseverance. But the reward is far greater than the cost. For in surrendering ourselves to the way of Jesus, the way of Christ, we gain the fullness of life with Jesus and life with God. The crossed up life we lead, a life that seeks to follow the Christ whose path intersected so completely with our own, is not one that can be imposed upon us. And perhaps the Reverend Jan Richardson says it best when she calls it a mystery that we can enter into only by choice. And that we must navigate with a spirit of discernment. She says, carrying the cross is not about casting about for a heavy burden to pick up. Neither does it require us to seek out situations of pain and danger that will cause damage to the person God calls us to be. It's about seeking a pattern of life that will open us the most fully to the God who created us in our particularity. The shape the cross takes for me in all my particularities and peculiarities will be different than it takes for you. The things I need to let go of, to choose against, to turn away from in order to make a space for Jesus at the center of my life may well be different than what you need to let go of or what the follower needs to let go of. But know that what we let go of makes space for things like love and tenderness and kindness. And what we allow in will reshape us, even pierce us. But God will be there in the journey of that creation as we become something unique and beautiful in God's eyes. I'll close with this. Diana Butler Bass goes on to say that kindness learned at home is kindness practiced in the world. And peace offered in the home is peace extended in the world. I wonder now, what would be the cost to all of God's people of not following in the way of Jesus? Amen.